A mother, Jessica, discovers that her parents have manipulated her 18-year-old daughter Lily into wiring her entire college fund, $43,000, to pay for a supposed surgery for the grandmother. A lie used to fund a down payment for another grandchild. After confronting her mother and collecting proof, Jessica brings a civil suit. The judge rules for Lily, forcing repayment. The family fractures. Lily, scarred but wiser, studies psychology and rebuilds a life with her mother, choosing trust earned over blind familial loyalty. The lasagna arrived steaming under a silver dome, and the house smelled like yeast and lemon, those smells that pretend to stitch things together. Lily sat at the long table like a small apologetic indentation in a room built for applause. Her hair in a careless braid, the collar of her coat still on, she moved as if she feared taking space would cause the china to tip. Across from her, Melissa laughed loud enough to make the candles flicker. Haley clapped like someone auditioning for approval. My mother, perfect hands, a voice that softened sentences, cut a slice and announced, "Help yourselves, dear," as if charity and family were the same language. That night began ordinary. Someone recounted a hospital story for repetition's sake. My father made a lazy joke about winter roads. Lily's laugh was careful, a practiced light. Then Haley tapped a spoon against a mismatched wine glass and stood. The room narrowed into one of those cinematic silences where you can hear the lamplight buzz. She smiled, bright, trained, and said, "I made an offer on a house." Applause spilled like confetti. I smiled with the others because I was, in that social muscle memory, supposed to. But my daughter's face set into a statue. Her fingers folded into one another, small crescents under the skin where she'd been gripping something much harder than curiosity. When the numbers came 43,000, they hung between forks and plates, absurd and solid. I heard the wire's confirmation like it was a sound inside my chest. Lily didn't clap. She didn't look away because she wanted to hide. She looked away because she was already elsewhere, the way children go to rooms inside themselves where adults rarely follow. "I'm tired," she whispered later as she fumbled on her coat. She took the bus. She said she needed air. I watched her leave, and the uneasy, buoyant mood at the table resumed its practiced orbit. An hour later the house became ours again, a narrow hallway, the hum of the refrigerator, the dark that makes small things sharp. Lily sat at the kitchen counter bathed in the pool of light from the pendant, face two tones, pale from the bus, red-rimmed from something else. Her phone lay face down, an altar of silence. She slid it over, and when I saw the transfer detail, Sashan Ling memo, for surgery. "Hope you're okay, heartsuit time, the real kind that carries futures," pressurized. She had given it all. Her college fund gone, a bright ledger of years evaporated into a message with a heart at the end. She didn't look like a thief. She looked exhausted and small, and the smallness that had been cultivated in her by dinner chairs, by comments left like crumbs, finally looked big enough to break something. That first evening, standing in the kitchen while the house outside settled into night, I understood what betrayal could sound like when it was polite. It sounded like concern. It sounded like family. We didn't speak at first. Language felt too large for the space between us, so we used the smaller things, a hand on a shoulder, the slow set of a jaw, the heat of two mugs where steam evaporated stories. She said she needed surgery, Lily whispered into her cereal bowl. The words were accurate and terrible, precise like evidence. There was a logic to them. If someone you trusted said they were hurting, any person would act. The horror was not only the lie. It was how easily she'd been placed in the line of sight and asked to step forward. I began to see the house like a stage set with decades of props. Photo walls with the same smiles, an entire drawer labeled for Haley's baking utensils, a charm bracelet that had been in one of Lily's childhood boxes and suddenly reappeared on Haley's wrist. Small favors repeated, layer into entitlement. When someone is accustomed to receiving, other people's boundaries shrink until absence is normalized. My mother had the gentle cadence of a storyteller and the art of making favors look like virtue. I'd tricked myself into calling it generosity for too long. We pulled the thread. Memory after memory unraveled like paper. A late birthday missed with a text that said, "Oh my, how terrible," Best wishes, Gigi, while Haley's half-birthday had a full cake and cash tucked into glitter. Tuition-sized requests deferred into sympathetic phone calls, a laundry list of small imbalances that had been rationalized as family traditions until the rationalization became its own excuse. Lily's voice was raw when she told me she hadn't planned it. She'd believed a face she loved. She said not to tell you, Lily said. She said I shouldn't worry, Mom. The very phrasing was a manipulation's masterstroke. Make the helper into a guardian of secrets and then praise them for their nobility. My mother had trained an 18-year-old to be the keeper of adult shame. I sat with the evidence in my hands. Wire confirmations, texts, a photo of Haley in a realtor's listing with captions of gratitude. The arithmetic was small and sharp, $43,000, but the damage was larger, a subtraction from trust that no spreadsheet could replace. I thought of the days I'd answered calls for, just this once, the months of small loans that felt reasonable until they weren't. There was a quiet tremor that came with knowing. It felt less like righteous anger and more like a being nudged awake from a long, polite sleep. Before I left to confront them, I watched Lily draw a line around a charm bracelet on a shelf and then, with a small, decisive motion, slide it into a drawer she wouldn't open. It was symbolic and mundane, sometimes the most cinematic acts are. When I arrived on their doorstep the next morning, under a sky the color of dishwater after rain, my hands were empty, but my mouth held the shape of questions. My mother took my arrival as a casual interruption, tea, robe, the domestic script, until I placed the word surgery into the room and watched her perform almost imperceptible calculations. She'd practiced generosity so often she could make a lie sound like a cure. The calm in her voice was made of years of practice. You told her not to tell me? I asked. She folded her hands like a hymn and said, She's a very thoughtful young woman. The sentence was small and poisonous. It reeked of an adulthood that had learned how to disguise transactions as affection. I left with no raised voices, only the slow realization that the quietest lies are often the most deliberate. The court did not look like anything out of a movie. It smelled like lemon oil and the nervous air that accumulates when secrets are meant to be airless. We arrived too early by design. There was a clarity in being punctual when the other side arrived on script. My parents walked in as if there had been no unraveling pearls, measured steps, a practiced apology in their eyes. Their attorney moved like a stage manager, all charm and cotton. At the center of the case was a single digital sentence, the wire memo. For surgery. Hope you're okay, Heartsuit. It was small and absurdly intimate, a private note turned into proof against them. The defense tried to make it look like confusion, an impulsive, generous act by an adult with money to spare. They painted Lily's youth as a weakness, merrily implying that a child's confusion was an adult's misunderstanding. That framing was meant to blot out responsibility. When Lily took the stand, she trembled in literal ways, knees shaking under the lectern, but the voice that came had been tempered in quiet places. She read the memo out loud as evidence and then said, without theatrical flair, what had been done to her, not to embarrass anyone, but to name the truth. The courtroom exhaled. Her memory was exact and ordinary. She did not scream or plead. She described the way you do when you must be believed, a steady inventory of facts framed by the quiet depth of someone who had been taught to defer. The defense attempted theater. They showed photos of Lily smiling in parties, told anecdotes to paint her as reckless. Their argument was corrosive in its simplicity. If she looked a certain way, she must be fine. The judge's response was with the bluntness of someone who knows how the law separates performance from proof. We will stick to facts, he said, and the word made the courtroom thinner, sharper. The turning point was not some dramatic outburst, but the slow, undeniable accumulation of evidence, timestamps, repeated texts, a bank confirmation that could not be erased by sentiment. The judge asked my mother directly, was there a scheduled surgery? The beat was humane and terrible. You can hear that question in small rooms where families have bent the truth into currency. My mother's answer was a practiced fog. Not scheduled, she said. Symptoms. The judge asked, more pointedly, whether any of the funds had been used for medical care. Silence in a courtroom is a kind of confession. It was then I realized that the twist of the story lived in how ordinary deceit is, not savage, not cinematic, but banal and practiced. People leverage affection and ritual until a young person believes secrecy is love. Lily's decision to bring the case was the pivot. She could have let it go, kept the tenderness where it had always been, but she chose to name the harm. It was a radical thing to do in the language of family, to press for accountability where silence had been the rule. After the judge ruled that the funds were obtained via misrepresentation, the immediate change was practical repayment, legal fees. But the deeper alteration was relational, a house listed for sale, a family line severed quietly. The midpoint was not the verdict alone, it was the moment when truth translated to consequence and the quiet architecture of favoritism collapsed into daylight. The days leading to the verdict were repeated ritual, paperwork, the soft grind of a printer, the fluttering of texts from relatives whose loyalty existed on a conditional basis. I kept a folder, 2 fingers thick, of messages that read like a slow-motion reveal. Please don't tell her, I didn't want to burden the family, I honestly don't remember the date. Each note was a small object lesson in how people soften the edges of responsibility. We rehearsed nothing and everything. Lily sat in the passenger seat and adjusted her navy blazer with a deliberateness that felt like armor. She chewed her lip until the skin caught. A person can be deliberate and fragile in the same breath. The courthouse waited, impersonal and immovable, a place where private ruptures become public procedure. My mother's lawyer smiled at the hallways with a condescension that seemed designed to be captured in memory. He framed the situation as a lamentable misunderstanding and played at wounded dignity when mention of repayment surfaced. Between pretrial and testimony, my mind would sneak back to the kitchen where Lily had shown me the wire memo. I replayed that tiny line of text like it was an invading film strip. The intimacy of the message, the small heart at the end, it was meant to humanize fraudulent exchange. It was what made it cruel, wrapping theft in tenderness. On the stand, the defense did what defenses do, distract, deflect, and then dress up lack of evidence as plausible motive. They attempted to reframe the narrative by suggesting that Lily's donation was a choice made in love, and any subsequent distress was her own failing. But the problem for them was that choice has to be informed. The law's language of consent collides with family's language of duty, and the collision is never pretty. The cross-examination was a knife in slow motion. Precise questions about dates, about text timestamps, about whether medical billing was provided. These were the places where the human script of manipulation frayed. My mother's face did not collapse, it stagnated, controlled. In quiet moments she would blink as if stunned by memory, like surfacing from sleep. The defense called witnesses friends who testified to my parents' generosity, but generosity has to be born of truth, not concocted through deception. Outside the courtroom the whispers began to take on their own shape. Some relatives chose to pretend the house had not been rocked. Others sent tentative messages, trying to reconcile what had been learned with their own need for comfort. We had prepared to lose connections, but preparing and losing are different forms of grief. The pressure was not only legal, it was social. The stakes were a daughter's future and the moral grammar of a family. When closing arguments came, the lawyer for my parents pivoted to rhetoric. Family should be a place of forgiveness. Our side replied with cold clarity, trust is not a resource to be mined. The judge's voice that afternoon carried the weight of precedence and intention. When he read his decision, found in favor of Lily, ordered restitution, the sound was not cathartic triumph. It was the mechanical settling of accountability. The climax was set. Justice had been administered in the way courts do, impartial, bureaucratic, and ultimately incapable of reknitting the small, tender thing that had been stolen, faith. The judge's words landed like a metronome, measured, final. Found in favor of the plaintiff. Repay the funds plus legal fees. Deliberate misrepresentation. For a moment everything felt oddly ordinary, an official recitation that codified what we had known in small private ways, but ordinary had teeth. My mother's gasp sounded less like pain and more like disbelief at being held accountable. My father bowed his head as if trying to disappear into the wooden bench. Haley's face was a study in betrayal and confusion. She'd been raised in a world where generosity was a right, not a condition. Lily didn't move. She had spent weeks preparing her voice to carry testimony, and now there was nothing to say. The verdict was a paper that said the truth in court had matched the truth at the kitchen table. It was a legal vindication that tasted of relief and salt. We stood together, awkwardly, like people who'd practiced intimacy by default and now had to learn it on purpose. The defense whispered, then scowled, trying to dress down consequence as misfortune. Outside, the landscape of neighborly chatter rearranged itself. The house that once stood as a curated testament to the family's brand, white columns, flower boxes, curated welcome, found a realtor sign planted in the yard. It was as if the physical structure could no longer bear the moral load. Selling a house is a tidy solution to a messy truth. Possessions that once signified status were now collateral in a moral reckoning. Haley slipped away, a young woman disoriented by having been told a lie from someone she loved. She stayed away, and that absence was one more wound. The whispers swelled. Some relatives called to say they hoped we could mend things, others insinuated our action had been performative. The social cost of insisting on clarity is often ostracism masked as wounded loyalty. There was one image that would haunt me, my mother, in a rental living room months later, sitting on a couch with no dishwasher hum and a thrifted lamp, telling a neighbor she was being punished for generosity. The language bent in on itself, generosity recast as victimhood. The moral inversion was dizzying. The cost of truth in our family had been distance. We'd regained money in a bank ledger. We'd lost the pretense of a family dinner. For Lily, the victory was smaller and purer. She had her name back in the ledger of her life. She had a ruling that recognized her as a person whose consent was manipulated. Legally, the court recognized what song we had been singing at the kitchen table. The notes had been false. Emotionally, her repair would take years. She'd lose calls, holidays, the casual shared jokes that stitched generations together. But she kept something else, a backbone made of facts and a refusal to let love be sold to her. That night we walked home under a sky freckled with indifferent stars. We spoke little. In the after, where there is always arithmetic and silence, I felt a new lightness and a new gravity at once. There was relief that the bank would return her fund. There was grief for what had been lost. In the quiet afterward, Lily took my hand, and for the first time in a long while, she did not pull away. Her fingers were warm and fierce. We had won in court. The cost was the family we had known, but the gain, her voice, her boundaries, felt like the truest kind of justice. We never got the hero's montage, no cameras camped at the courthouse steps, no viral hashtag, no crowd cheering. Instead, the aftermath unfolded in small domestic scenes. Lily folding laundry at our kitchen table, pausing to underline a passage in a behavioral theory book, me watching a sunbeam split across the counter like a clean line. The world outside moved on, indifferent to the moral calculus that had upended our dinners. Inside, something rebuilt. Lily went back to campus with a quiet that looked older than she was. She chose psychology partly out of curiosity and partly as a way to turn the pain into study. She wanted language to name what had happened, to understand not only that someone lied, but how someone could wrap manipulation in so much tenderness that a child would take it as love. Her notebooks filled with questions. What makes people prioritize one child over another? When does care become control? She read case studies and swallowed them like medicine. Our home rearranged itself. There were unspoken rules, no calls from numbers we'd erased, no invitations to sit at tables that used to tilt. Some relatives disappeared as if their silence had been there all along. Others offered tentative olive branches that felt like paper apologies. We accepted some, declined others. The charm bracelet went into a drawer and stayed there. It was a small, decisive absence. Sometimes, in the evenings when the music sat between dishes and textbooks, Lily would laugh, a soft, domestic sound, and I felt the shape of us change into something I wanted. Not perfect, not deniable, but honest. We had to teach ourselves new rituals, ritual dinners without the drama of obligation, new holidays where the guest list was curated for safety. There was freedom in that curation, like a room finally tuned to the scale of the people who belonged. What I learned was surgical. You cannot love someone into believing you are kind. You can only give them evidence that you are. We had chosen transparency over preservation, and that choice had cost us a family. It also gave Lily a vocabulary, boundaries, consent, restitution that would guard her future. On nights when the ache returned, I looked at the memo on the phone in the small archive I kept, screenshots, bank confirmations, and I felt both fury and gratitude. Fury because the deception had been elegant and habitual. Gratitude because the digital trail had brought us to a courtroom where truth could be held up and measured. A year and a half later, Lily stands at a podium in a small lecture on developmental psychology, her voice steady as she talks about trust and learning. She still says yes to help, but she asks questions first. She reads contracts now. She checks receipts. She is softer and harder in the same movements, softer toward self, harder about what she will accept from others. Sometimes people ask why we didn't let it go, why we traded a dinner for legal action. I tell them plainly, because silence cost a future. Because love that looks like a transaction is theft disguised. Because teaching an 18-year-old that family can exploit her is a lesson that will echo for decades. We lost passive affection, we gained agency. When she calls now on purpose, not out of duty, her voice contains a small, steady music. She's not joyous in a way that erases pain. She's strong in a way that includes it. That is, perhaps, the quiet justice of our choice, that the daughter who once sat small at a table now occupies space without apology. And for that, the loss of the old family is a trade I would make again.